Greetings everyone, Sawubona, salutations to everyone around the world who may be tuning into this. My name is Dingani Klaba, and the dates today is Thursday, November 21st, in Durban, KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. This is another episode of my blog where I kind of talk about things that are going on in my life, various topics that kind of interest me at the time. Been meaning to put out a video about my father for a while, who passed away June 11th this year in 2019 from Parkinson's disease, long protracted battle from that disease. His name was Ndiko Klaba, for those not aware. A famous jazz musician here from South Africa who traveled all across the world, and it definitely left a legacy of a long career of political activism combined with his music and his arts. You know, he passed away at a very old age. He was 85 years old, sorry. He had Parkinson's for maybe 10, 15 years, quite a while. And so, as someone who has been involved with some of the care work involved with taking care of him in his older ages, it was quite difficult to see the man who gave birth to you to struggle in that way. But to a certain extent, I can say for sure that I felt a lot of relief knowing that he made his transition as peacefully as he could have made it, and that his suffering was finally over. And so for that we say, in my family we have a saying, Shabbat Nankos, which means of the ancestors. And I know that wherever he is now, he is definitely in a better place. And so that gives me, my family members, and everyone who, you know, knew him well and loved and respected him, a lot of gratitude and a lot of good feeling. So first, I guess, where I want to start off is talking about his life, you know, from beginning to end, just sort of summarizing who he was as an individual, what he did, and you know, how he affected so many people in so many positive ways. So my father was born in a town not too far away from here called Pietermaritzburg in South Africa in 1936 to his parents, Jonathan and Emily Klaba, who were both teachers, both educators. In fact, that seems to be kind of a theme in my family. My father's side of the family, they all tend to be, we're very well known for either being translators and educators, basically, translators and teachers. And so my father was born into this tradition. My grandfather, his father, Jonathan, was also a well-known pastor. On top of which, he was also a very influential member. We're just starting to figure out, my father just figured out later on in his life, you know, that his father was actually a founder of one of the oldest, if not the oldest, teachers union in South Africa, Black Teachers Union in South Africa. National Federation of Teachers, I believe, is the name of it. It's still around today, actually. In fact, at their headquarters, they named the Union Hall after my father, who was its first president, and basically was a pivotal founding member of that union, which, you know, was amazing for me to hear, and also very, very, very funny in a way, because it just goes to show you how, you know, we can't get away from our genetics to a certain extent. I myself, you know, as I've talked about in vlog episodes previously, have been involved in unions. I was a union organizer for one of the oldest labor unions in America, known as the IWW, which is the International Industrial Workers of the World. And even my grandfather on my mother's side was also a union organizer. In fact, he was a union steward for one of the other very old, well-recognized unions in America called the AFL-CIO. So as you can see, union organizing runs deep in the family gene. So, you know, it's kind of interesting to see that parallel, you know, on both sides of the family. But yeah, going back to my father, Ndiko, he was born in Pietermaritzburg. He spent a lot of his youth traveling to various parts of South Africa. He started off, obviously, his journey started off in Pietermaritzburg. He moved to Ladysmith. He lived in East London for a time. He even lived in Cape Town for a while. He would sort of spend his early years going back and forth between schools, in between various different cities in South Africa. His father and my mother's work basically remaining the same, being educators, essentially. Eventually, he would discover the passion of his life, which would be music. He would go on to start many different groups, many different musical groups that would mainly focus, I would say, on jazz. You know, as was the case back then and is still today to a certain extent, South African arts and culture was very, very influenced by American arts and culture. American arts and culture, of course, influences the cultures of, you know, thousands of different, millions of different people all around the world. We're sort of known for that. In South Africa in particular at that time, the whole jazz movement, the bebop movement, was very, very, the big band movement, very, very influential here. My father was a huge fan of that, and I think that was what really motivated him to pursue music as a full-time venture, as what he wanted to do. He started off playing flute. He eventually taught himself piano, and went on to teach himself various other instruments, even to the point where he started to make his own instruments. Very, very passionate, very focused on his craft. Eventually, he would get an opportunity to star and to become an actor, basically, for an organization called Donkey House. I don't believe Donkey House is still around, but back then it was a very, very well recognized institution, arts institution. And he got an opportunity to play in a couple different plays with them. I can't remember the names off the top of my head. But the big opportunity he got was to actually come over to America and star in the first South African play on Broadway called Sponono. And he, along with 20 or so others, a couple dozen others, South African citizens, were given the opportunity to travel to America and go to Broadway to star in this play, which he did successfully. At that time, he was also coming under some heat from the South African Special Police Forces. So for those that don't know, during that time, South Africa was under an apartheid system where everything was essentially segregated. There was institutions for blacks, and there were institutions in special areas only for blacks, for whites. And typically the white areas, the white institutions for education and healthcare obviously were much better than the institutions given to blacks. And so this created a very unequal, uneven society in which, you know, blacks and coloreds and everyone else who was not white had a lot of grievances. And as a result of that, the African National Congress was started as a way to sort of combat that and to transform South Africa into a more egalitarian, I guess you could say, equitable society. And so my father, as a result, became very political. He joined the African National Congress. What he did not know at the time was that his father, my grandfather, Jonathan, was a very pivotal figure in the ANC at that time. It turns out that at that time the ANC was, you know, underground. They were a banned organization by the South African state, and so they had to do a lot of things underground, a lot of clandestine activity. And a lot of that clandestine organizing actually happened in the churches, because the churches were the one institutions that, black churches that is, were the institutions that the South African white states generally left alone. Generally, they gave them a special status. They didn't come under the same scrutiny and the same regulation and red tape that a lot of other black organizations did at the time, like the ANC. So the ANC found haven with, sympathetic supporters of, black clergy. And my father, Jonathan, was one of those sympathetic people. He allowed the ANC spaces to organize their meetings within his church. In fact, I believe his church was one of the places that the ANC actually founded the organization. So my grandfather was a very, very pivotal, very key person who was pivotal in starting the African National Congress, which we all know today, of course, is the government of South Africa, essentially, right? For now. So that history, my father didn't actually know about his father up until very, very recently, late in his life. And it came as sort of an interesting surprise, I think, to the rest of us. Not too surprising from the standpoint that, well, of course, this is kind of in our blood, obviously, but we had no idea how important Jonathan was to the ANC, to the union movement, and to, his community at large. Definitely a pillar of the community on his own. But to fast forward to what I was talking about with Sponono, sometime in between that, while doing his acting thing and joining the ANC, my father became aware that, the South African government, the South African agents were chasing him, and he had an opportunity to go overseas. So he took that opportunity. He very narrowly was able to get his visa to actually travel to America, but once he got it, he came to New York. He lived with various other South African musicians, artists who had came before him, including the famous artist Miriam Makeba, who at that time was married to another famous jazz musician named Hugh Masekela. So, the South African art scene in America, especially the South African community, is very small, very tight, well known, and very, very tight knit. And so they all knew each other. And, my father was very well known to these guys and vice versa. So, he lived there for a bit. Once the play was over, he decided that he wasn't going to go back because obviously South Africa was, a very unsafe place to go as a result of, being visited and being intimidated by the police forces, basically saying, we have our eye on you, we know what you're doing, and just know that we see you, basically. And so because of that intimidation, my father wisely, I think, chose to stay in America for the time being. He got his permanent residency and he was able to stay, got his work visa and was able to work at various different places. He traveled all across America. I think his first place after New York was going to Houston, where he worked on the docks for a while there. Houston, known back then and probably still today, as a huge port city. So there was work for him there. And after that, he immigrated to the West Coast, where he found a home in California, specifically San Francisco, where he met my mother in 1973, I believe. At that time, he was teaching a Zulu class, a Zulu language class. And, considering 1970s America back then was sort of bubbling with this newfound black consciousness activity, black people were becoming more and more curious and more aware of their African heritage, and we're trying to get back to that. My mother was no different, and as a result, she attended this class that my dad was teaching, and that's how they met. After that, they came together, they married, and they traveled, all across the U.S. Eventually starting from San Francisco, made their way back east to New York. They lived in Washington, D.C., Providence, various places on the East Coast. During that time, having two children, my oldest brother, Makawe, and my second oldest, Makosi. And then they went to Toronto, Canada, where my third oldest brother, Sipo, the one next to me, Manla, was born. And then from there, they got an opportunity to travel to Tanzania, where the ANC had set up a exile camp for South African exiles, basically political exiles who were trying to escape the political repression in South Africa. And so my father and my mother came there, basically as teachers at this camp. That was sometime in the 80s. I want to say somewhere between 1983 and 1986. And they stayed there for about 3 or 4 years, and then eventually things had kind of run their course there. To make a long story short, my mother decided that she was going to come back to America, and my father decided that he was going to stay back. And so my mother, with her children at that time, Maklawe, Makosi, and Sipo, came back to America. They came back to live in Chicago with my auntie Gwen. That was back in, I want to say, 1986 or 1987. My father stayed back for a time, and then maybe couple years later, he was actually able to make his way back to Chicago. By that time, my family, my mother's and her kids, were living in a predominantly black, I want to say township, but suburb, as we call them in America, predominantly black, impoverished suburb in Chicago called Harvey, Illinois, where I was born in 1989. And sure, that's when I enter into the scene. At that time, my father is still continuing on with his music. My mother is a secretary. She worked for, she also worked as an educator. She also worked as a secretary for, I think, Northwestern, and another very famous office. I'm forgetting the name now. Anderson. Various jobs like that. By the time, my memory was able to serve me, she was working as she was working as a cashier at a co-op, a cooperative grocery store called Oak Street Co-op, which eventually got bought out by Whole Foods Co-op, which of course nowadays is this huge international organic foods grocery store, essentially. Bought out a whole lot of neighborhood co-ops, and Oak Street was one of them. And so after that, she went back to teaching. And my father, again, stayed pretty consistent on his gigs and on doing his art. As far as I can remember, my father was at the piano every single day, every single night. He was either doing his piano or he was reading the newspaper. That was his grind. That was his preferred passion, as I should say. I remember, all the musicians and the jams that he used to have at the house, the performances that he and my mom would collaborate on and go to these various schools, and they would bring me up on stage and say, "This is our kid," to hundreds of other kids and other people. It was quite an experience as a young kid, to be just thrown up there on stage, with your parents. It makes you definitely feel some type of way. For sure I was very nervous. For sure I was very, very, but also very proud, and very at ease with myself. My parents did a great job in teaching me to be content with myself and to go for as much as I could get in this life. And, I think of those days back in Chicago in the suburbs, and, definitely some of my happiest memories for sure. My dad from a very early age definitely taught me the importance of going for gold, basically, pushing to get as much as you can achieve in this world and in this lifetime. And that much I'm very thankful for. Sometime in 97, 98, we moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, because my mom got an opportunity to become a teacher in Milwaukee. And also in Milwaukee, the cost of living was a lot less. So economically, it was just the best decision for us. So we moved there. My father came along, but you know, you could kind of tell that there was some tension in the family, some tension between him and her, which happens, you know, after a marriage of, by that time, what, 30, at least 20 years. You know, there was a lot of tension in that. I don't know if the move to Milwaukee had anything to do with that. I think there was always tension in the relationship. But it definitely got to a head at a certain point. And at that time, you know, South Africa was fresh off of apartheid. In 94, 95, South Africa was finally able to shake off the demon of apartheid. All the old guys in government positions in power, the white guys in power, they were disposed of, and democratic elections were held for the first time, where Nelson Mandela, the head of the ANC, the founder and member of the ANC, and the most pivotal liberation, you know, South African liberation leader, was elected to the presidency. And so major changes were happening in South Africa, and major optimism was happening, where people finally felt like we have an opportunity now. Black people in particular felt like we have an opportunity now to take back what's ours, to live the lives that we've always wanted to live. And so my father, having not returned to South Africa for, you know, at that point, since the late 60s, early 70s, about 30 years now. And, you know, with tension between him and Ma at the same time, he felt that the best thing for him at that point was to come back home to South Africa and to start his life anew. Thereby in the process leaving behind his children, Makosi, who was, you know, entering adulthood at that time and getting ready to go to college. Sipho, who was still a baby for all intents and purposes. I think he was in middle school at the time, maybe high school, I think middle school. And me, who definitely was a baby and, you know, just basically getting into elementary and learning to read and write and all of that. So it was, I was 8 years old, and I remember it like it was yesterday. You know, at the time I didn't feel good about it, but I didn't necessarily feel bad about it either. It seemed like something that, you know, the transition, the way that my parents handled it, they handled it with a level of style and grace in which it wasn't a sloppy transition. You know, it wasn't this thing where there were a whole lot of negative feelings towards the other publicly. You know what I mean? They kind of let me know that, like, look, this is for the best, not just for him, but for everyone, including yourself. You might not realize it now, but we feel good about it. And so them feeling good about